of our defense as we begin our defensive overview. In 1966, Bill Dooley became the head coach at the University of North Carolina. And through Bill Dooley's beginning years, North Carolina was really noted for its offense, played very porous defense, and very often Bill Dooley's great teams were noted for winning, just like their basketball teams, winning 35, 34, 28, 27. But in 1976, 10 years after he had come to North Carolina, they began the fundamentals of a reduced scheme with multiple coverages. It was a real simple process, one in which he had taken a little bit from University of Arkansas. But by 1977, North Carolina made a dramatic change and was first in the NCAA in scoring defense, and that year, you may remember, played Nebraska in the Liberty Bowl. In 1978, after 11 years and 6 bowls at North Carolina, Bill Dooley left the University of North Carolina and proceeded to Virginia Tech. And that is where Steve Bernstein, my secondary coach, and myself joined the scheme. And in 1978, we had a very modest beginning with 4 wins. In 1979, we won 5 games, but it was an instrumental year, a landmark year, in that we adopted the Eagle safety concept. Steve Bernstein had a lot to do with that idea, and we have continued it to this day, and it's one of the things that has made our scheme very unique among college schemes, and is something that we'll go into in greater depth as we go through this overview. From that point on, from 1980 until 1985, Virginia Tech could lay claim during that period of being the most successful major college defense in the country. And you can see in 1980, we were 4th in the nation in scoring defense, 6th in rushing defense, went to the first bowl game that Virginia Tech had been to in 12 years. We were 8-3 and played Miami in the Peach Bowl. In 1981, we also had a fine season. We were ranked in the top 10 in scoring defense. 1982 was also a high water year, and for the first time in Virginia Tech's history, Virginia Tech was first in the nation in rushing defense. We gave up 49 yards a game, which was at that point the best ever in college football. After that season, I left to become the defensive coordinator at the University of Colorado. Steve Bernstein stayed at Virginia Tech, and they missed me a great deal. They finished first in scoring defense and first in rushing defense, finished 9-2 in '83. They finished second in scoring and second in rushing defense in the nation in 1984. And then after that point, I convinced Steve to come with me to the University of Colorado. Now, the scheme itself was used in 1978 by Virginia Tech, as we'd mentioned, the most successful major college defense in those years. In 1983 by Colorado when I went there. And Colorado was the doormat of the Big 8, was routinely beaten by everybody in the conference. In fact, had finished 8th in the league 3 consecutive years. And the year before this scheme came into effect, there was 105th out of 105 in total defense. In 1983, we did not make much of a dent in those statistics. We were ranked 100th in the NCAA in total defense. In 1984, we ranked 88th, showing some significant improvement. In 1985, when Steve joined me and took all the credit for it, we ranked 17th in the NCAA in total defense, and then began a series of great years. In 1986, we ranked 11th in total defense. The other university who was using our scheme, interestingly enough, is Florida, who we met this year in the All-American Bowl. And Florida's defensive coordinator also worked for Bill Dooley, and this year ranked 4th in the NCAA in total defense. And here at Illinois, we ranked 3rd in the Big Ten our first year out of the box, and 28th in the NCAA in total defense. Now, those statistics and that history is just shown to you so that we can show some credibility in the scheme itself. Again, as I mentioned at the top in our introduction, we are not trying to sell to sell our scheme. But there are some interesting things about our scheme. And number one is that there is a real common thread that runs through all three programs that used a multiple reduction scheme. None of them had a lot of nationally recruited athletes on defense. At Virginia Tech, we were very much a regional recruiting outfit. At Colorado, we rarely competed for the top 100 players in the country. And at this point at Illinois, we are not at the point where we garner the very best athletes in the nation. But many of the top 20 programs base their defenses on what we call 50 principles. They use 4 linebackers with very similar skills and attributes, and they use 3 dominant defensive linemen. And that's a look of a scheme that would be very much used in a 50 scheme. The nose guard here and the weak side linebacker are circled simply because in that scheme, those are 2 of the positions that can be classified as perhaps role players. Well, one of the things that you'll find different is that at each of those places, not only is it difficult to recruit the great athletes in the country, but we felt because of that, it was very important that role-playing became a very strong alternative. And as our scheme has evolved, role-playing has become more and more important as we've gone through the last 11 years. Role-playing ideally permits each player to perform within his strengths. That is the concept, the most important concept of role-playing. The less a player is asked to expose his weaknesses, the stronger the scheme itself becomes. And what I'll attempt to do in the next 2 overlays will be to show you the personnel that plays in our positions, how we role play with each of them, and we can have as many as 11 different positions in our scheme. The advantage to that is that we can match personnel to meet those positions, and that those positions are asked to do less than they would if they played simply a left or right position in the scheme. To begin with, we'll start with our top personnel who play up front for us. And I'll begin with our 3-technique tackle. Our 3-technique tackle is a guy who plays almost solely over a guard. He is rarely asked to play out over a tackle. The 3-technique can be a limited player in that he is asked primarily to protect a linebacker behind him. He is never asked to have the kind of great skills that would ask him to contain the quarterback very often, take an outside phase of the option. He is an inside player, maybe a large nose guard type, a guy who does not have to be in any way a complete defensive lineman. Now, the guy who's playing that spot for us this year was a sophomore by the name of John Walker from Wheaton North High School, and John took 3 or 4 games to get the feel. He had been a converted linebacker, but he got to play within his strengths, and his strengths were that he was a very disciplined player, that he could maintain the line of scrimmage, protect our linebackers. At nose guard, we have a kind of a celebrated player by the name of Mo Gardner. 6'2", 244, a sophomore from Cathedral High School in Indianapolis, and he was a first-team All-Big Ten player despite the fact that he missed the last 3 games in the Big Ten. But nose guard itself is a role-playing position. We don't have to have a huge defensive lineman. At Colorado, our last 2 years in the Big 8, we had a first-team All-Big 8 nose guard who was 5'11", 240 pounds. And he could role play and do all the things that we asked him to do at nose. Mo could probably play nose or 3-technique, but he is a smaller lineman, and his strengths are used most definitely at nose guard. Now, the most complete player in the front five, and probably the only guy that we kind of feel has to be a complete player, is our five technique. And we search high and far to try to find one great lineman. At Oklahoma, at Nebraska, at Miami of Florida, places with great talent, they probably line up with three guys like that. We searched to try and find one who is a complete player, and this year was Mel Agee, a 6'4", 275-pound sophomore from Washington High School in Chicago. He was second team All-Big Ten, and he also missed 3 games this year with injuries. But more is required of him. He must do the things that the three technique and nose guard do. In addition, he must be a contained rusher. In addition, he must be able to take some skilled players in the outside phases of the option. Looking at our linebacker core, we again begin with our rush linebacker. Our rush linebacker flips with the three technique and with the eagle linebacker. And our rush linebacker is also a role player. Our rush linebacker is a young guy who does not have to be a complete player. He must be able to dominate a tight end on a one-on-one block, and he must be able to dominate an offensive tackle and pass rush. Sean Turner played that position very adequately for us this year, 6'3", 235. And interestingly enough, he was a fifth-year senior who had never played here before. He had never been on the field in 4 years. And yet we found a role that he could fill very adequately because of the limited nature of that position. And we've had a lot of different types play there. You'll see in our film, sometimes we've had guys who have played up in 2-point stances. At other times we've had guys like Sean who are down linemen and who have played down in 3-point stances. We've also had an interestingly strong number of nose guards who have come out and played at that position. So you can really role play and get some different things done there with the rush. At eagle linebacker, this is an inside linebacker position that does not require great size. Whereas Steve Glasson at 6'2" and 216 from Stagg High School in Palos Hills, where Steve may have some real difficulty playing for Oklahoma because of his size, in our scheme he is more than large enough. In fact, probably the best eagle linebacker that we ever had was a kid by the name of Ashley Lee at Virginia Tech. He led us in tackles in 1980 as a true freshman and to the Peach Bowl. And he was picked by Football News as the best freshman player in the country. He was 6'1", 182 pounds playing that spot. Again, he role plays. We ask him to take on blockers very, very seldom. For the most part, he is a pursuit, tackle, and coverage guy. And so he does not have to be a complete player. The next guy who comes closest to being a complete player in our linebacker core is the inside linebacker. And this is manned this year by a young guy by the name of Derek Brownlow, 5'10", 229, and that's an unusual size for a linebacker in the Big Ten, a sophomore from Cathedral. He led the Big Ten in tackles and was first team All-Big Ten for us this year. That is a position that is very similar to a 50 inside linebacker. He is not protected. He must take on the giant guards in this conference. He has got to be a pretty complete player. And yet as we go through our history, we found all types there who have played before. Barry Remington was all Big 8 at Colorado, was a 6'4", 225 guy. Mike Johnson, who was a high round draft choice, a leading tackler for the Cleveland Browns right now, was a 6'2", 220 nose guard coming out of high school who filled that position for us well. The last position in the front seven is what we call our drop linebacker. And Romero Bryce, I think, is very typical of the drop linebackers who have played in this scheme over the past decade. Romero is 6'3", 205, a sophomore from McDonough High School in New Orleans. Romero does not have the great size of the Lawrence Taylors of the world. Romero is a guy who must depend upon movement, and he is going to line up both over a tight end and over wide receivers very often. When he lines up over a tight end, his strength must be his movement. His advantage over a tight end must be his movement. It is not going to be a strength. He is not going to be a complete player, whereas Ohio State may play a guy there who is 6'4" and 235, and he could match up well one-on-one with most tight ends. We have never had that type at our drop position. Our guys have always been at Virginia Tech or Rick Miley at 6'1", 191 pounds. At Colorado, our most valuable player, Darren Schubeck, who was 208 pounds, and yet performed very well against the great tight ends in the Big 8 Conference because he used his advantage. He operated from his strength, which was quickness over a big tight end, rather than great strength and size. Moving to our secondary, in our secondary we also role played, and I mentioned to you in the history that our role playing was increased to include the secondary in the 1979 season at Virginia Tech, and this was done largely by Steve Bernstein, our secondary coach. And we chose to have a strong safety, and strong safety is probably a misnomer. He should probably be called an eagle safety, who would always flip, not just to the strong side, but he would always be rolled up, always in a contained position, whether we were in a strong reduction or a weak reduction. Glenn Cobb finished the season at that position for us, 6 feet, 197, a senior. I think Glenn is also very typical of the strong safeties we've had in the past. He was first team All Big Ten, and yet I can tell you that Glenn Cobb will be a marginal NFL guy because of his lack of speed. The guy that preceded him in the scheme was a guy by the name of Mickey Pruitt from Robeson High School, who played at Colorado for us. He was 3 times first team All Big 8, and yet he was not drafted. He did, however, make it with the Bears this year as a free agent. But the strong safety position is a position that can be grooved, can be played by a journeyman kind of guy who doesn't have great speed, or perhaps even by a young, talented player who doesn't have great experience. And by and large, in our 6 base zone coverages, our strong safety is a flat and contained guy. He is never asked to take the deep zones or to cover usually the great wide receivers in this league. And so he always operates again from his strengths, and his strengths are being a forceful run guy and covering underneath routes. The role playing at corner can vary from year to year. There have been some years when we have had a real featherweight at corner who was strictly a cover guy. That happened with a guy by the name of Lyle Pickens in 1985. Lyle was about a 5'9", 160-pound corner, and the Big 8 teams chose to pick him out and really run at him. And so one way in which we can role play with a small corner is to flip him behind the strong safety and actually make a strong corner and a weak corner. Here at Illinois, we did not find that necessary to do, but I can tell you that in any case, our corners rarely have run support. They can be recruited primarily as cover guys, as great athletes, as speed guys if we can get them. We don't have to have real strong physical corners. And our corners are left and right this year. They're manned by Chris Green, 5'11", 180-pound sophomore from Lawrenceburg High School in Indianapolis, and Henry Jones, a 6-foot sophomore from University High School in St. Louis, Missouri. Now the free safety spot is a very unique one in our scheme, and as you look at our scheme and say, where are the complete players? Where are the guys that you have to look at first? I would say at 5 technique and an inside linebacker, as we've already noted, and then the third and maybe the most important is at free safety. Because at free safety, we ask a guy to be all the things that a typical free safety is in most traditional secondaries. He must be a center fielder. He must be a great athlete. He must be the guy who calls most of our checks as we move along with different formations and our scheme gets more complicated. But in our scheme, he is a prime run support guy. And so he must be as well a very physical support guy because our corners are not. Our safeties are the heavy run support guys. And this was manned very well for us by Marlon Primos, 6'3", 204, probably the best freshman player in the Big Ten this year, was second team All Big Ten from Banning High School in Carson, California. As we move on, we will talk a bit now about our philosophy. And you've gotten a touch of the feel of our philosophy in terms of role playing. And again, to reiterate that, role playing allows you to get the most accomplished without complete players. Role playing gives each position fewer techniques to master, and by that we mean that a three-technique tackle must only master the blocks that are involved when he's covered over a guard. He has to learn to play both left and right sides, but he must only master those blocks. Whereas a five-technique tackle just must master the blocks that he sees, and they're pretty traditional. They get a lot of reps, and because they're playing within their strengths and they play the same things over and over again, they have a chance to get better. I would say the second part of our philosophy, and just as important though, is stopping the run. We believe that the running game, both on offense and defense, is the thing that correlates most highly with winning. And here are some interesting statistics from this past year. And you'll see that, and this is not at all unusual. In fact, the statistics have been this strong or stronger over the past 20 years. But you can see the top rushing offenses and the top rushing defenses are almost always big winners. In 1988, the top 10 rushing defenses won 86% of their games, and 9 of the 10 teams were in bowls, and the only one that wasn't was a MAC school that didn't win the league and therefore didn't qualify for a bowl. Offenses, the top 10 rushing offenses won 74% of their games, and 7 of those teams were in bowl games. That's not nearly as true for the top 10 passing teams. And the defenses, the top 10 passing defenses won only 56% of their games as opposed to 86% of the top 10 rushing defenses. And only 3 of the top 10 pass defensive teams were in bowl games. The top 10 passing offenses won only 65% of their games, and only 4 of those teams were in bowl games. And so it's one way to point out to you how important we feel that stopping the run is in terms of being a successful defense. With that in mind, how do you stop the run? Well, these are certainly not all the concepts, but I think these are some general concepts in a very simplified fashion. One is play a balanced front with a balanced coverage, a la Oklahoma, much as Woody Hayes did during his great career at Ohio State. And primarily, those schools with great talent can line up and say, we're going to be sound, we're going to be very fundamental, we're going to play you in a balanced look and stop you from making big plays, and we will win. 2, you can stunt or blitz. And in this area, of course, the Chicago Bears are known very much for it. On the college level, South Carolina is known very much as a blitzing team, a stunning team. And those kind of teams can embarrass an offense. Those are both genuine ways to stop the run. They are not, however, the way in which we fashion ourselves. And I'm not saying that's not effective. This is just the way we choose to, and ours is C, and that is outnumber people at the line of scrimmage. And at Illinois and in Colorado, we felt those were the best ways to stop the running game. Now, by way of example, let's look at a couple of balanced fronts. Balanced fronts basically against today's offenses are 6-on-6. And by that, we mean that there are 6 potential blockers at the line of scrimmage. And defensively, there are 6 in a 50 defense. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at or on the line of scrimmage to defend against the 6 on offense. Woody Hayes, Barry Switzer would say that's fine. Our 6 are as good or better than yours, and we can now stop you in your attempt to run the football. For us at Illinois, we play these fronts only when we feel that we are equal to or better than our opponent, and we'll also play them in down and distances which we are heavily favored. If it is a 3rd and 12 situation, to be 6 on 6 is not a problem. If it's a 2nd and 12 situation, to be 6 on 6 is not a problem. So whenever we get into those situations, we will play a 30 defense, as you see in front of you. Or another common defense is the strong eagle. Again, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at or on the line of scrimmage, defending against 6 potential blockers. The ratio that we would rather have in a run situation is, rather than a 6 on 6 ratio, we would prefer to have a 7 on 6 ratio that would put more things at our advantage. And one way that we can do that, and now this is where Bill Dooley began back in the 70s. He began with this front, which was a weak side reduction, and this now gives us a 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on 6 ratio advantage. Now, this is a common field reduction where the ball might now be on the right hash mark. And we would also feel that we outnumber people here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that safety or corner or strong safety, whomever does that in your scheme, becomes the additional player to that side of the reduction. But both those are examples of 7 on 6 that we use quite frequently here at the University of Illinois. Now, the first step that most people took when they saw others in a 7 on 6 situation was they said, all right, we'll balance them up and we'll get 7 potential blockers. We will put 2 tight ends in the game and have 7 at the line, and so now they'll be forced to play a 7 on 7 or maybe move out of their reduction to a 30 defense, which a lot of teams still do. This particular configuration is what most weak side reductions did in the 70s when they saw 2 tight ends go into the game. And this was very noted in our area by Florida State. We were a reduction team. Florida State was a reduction team. Florida State chose to reduce to the weak side. The thing we did not like about that was that the rush linebacker was put down in a position over a tackle with a potential doubles team outside of him, which he saw rarely, and they had to squirm up a corner who was very much uncomfortable playing kick-out blocks with a power or sweep by the tight end. But they had the numbers there. The numbers were there. They had 8 on 7. But we didn't like the configuration in which they did it. We chose, instead, to go ahead and reduce to the strong side. That's a very common front for us. If you go back and look at the 7 on 6, that was no different than our field reduction 7 on 6. And again, we were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 on 7, and yet we did not have the personnel mismatch that Florida State had on a weak side, and we could do it from our conventional defense. And so those are looks at balanced 6 on 6, 7 on 6, and last year 8 on 6 type ratios. If you just listened in our huddle, spring practice, or during the season, you would see that our huddle calls consist of a placement, a front, a possible stunt, and a coverage. For example, you might hear in the huddle, field, falcon, nose, cover 0. And the field is a placement call which places our strong safety, our rush linebacker, our 3 technique, our eagle backer, and could even include our strong side corner. Falcon would tell the front, wherever they lined up, Those would be the techniques they would play. Nose would be a particular stunt that would involve one or two people, and then our coverage would be a zero coverage. Now, let me just go through our placement calls with you and give you a general idea so that when we get a chance to talk, you'll understand at least some of our terminology. All right, when we're on the boundary, two of the calls that we can make are field calls or short calls. So that first placement call you would hear, if it were a field call, then that would mean that our rush linebacker would go to the field, the strong safety would go to the field, the eagle linebacker would go to the field, and our three technique tackle would go to the field. We could, in fact, flip a corner with that if we chose to, as we've mentioned before. But all those people would flip together. They would play whatever the front was called. The strong safety would call out the field placement. Now, should we be in that exact same situation and called short, right, then we would couple with a short call an odd coverage, with a field call an even coverage. But now again, our strong or eagle safety would come to the short side of the field. Our rush linebacker would come to the short side of the field. Our three technique would come to the short side of the field. And our eagle backer would come to the short side of the field. They would all play the same front as they did in the call before, but now they would be to the short side of the field as opposed to the strong side of the field. All right, should we be on the hash or in the middle of the field, we could also make a strong call. This would be the third type of call that we can make. And now simply the strong safety breaks the huddle, much as a traditional strong safety would do. He finds the two receiver side. He goes to that side, but along with him tag the rush linebacker, the three technique, the eagle backer, and perhaps a corner. We might also make a weak call. And with a weak call, we would call also an odd coverage call. And our strong safety now would go to the one receiver side, or the weak side of the formation, followed by our rush, our eagle, our three, and perhaps even our corner. All right, the next type of placement call we have is most interesting. It's one of the calls that ensures our defense of having a 7-on-6 ratio. When we know it's a run situation or we are behind schedule and we must have a tough run defense and we want this configuration, we want to have 7-on-6 split, ensures us that we will get that. Now, what we don't know is whether the strong safety in a split call is going to the weak side or to the strong side. And because of that, we have to give a combination coverage. And it simply says strong safety if you go to the weak side of the formation. If the split end is the weak side of the formation, then you will give us an odd coverage. And if it's to the strong side of the formation, you would give us an even coverage. So as you lined up against this particular pro split formation, and the strong safety came to this point and saw one receiver, one wide out to that side, he would give us an odd coverage. So we might call split falcon 2-1. And if he came to the one receiver side, we would use the odd call. Right? In contrast to that is the bottom picture. Now again, our strong safety would come out and he would find the split receiver. Let's say that is the X. He would go to that side. But now, rather than being to the one receiver side, there are two receivers to the side. It's twins. And so instead of giving us the odd coverage in the combination call, we would get the even coverage in the combinations call. So this would also be called split hawk as a front, 2-1, and now when we came to the two receiver side, we would call out the even coverage, which would then be cover 2. But it ensures us of that ratio. That is a 7-on-6 ratio, and split will always get that for us. All right, so those are our placement calls. Quickly, in terms of the fronts themselves, there are just two major fronts here that I would show to you. We use them both in our scheme. One is a reduction that is called Falcon, and I think there are a number of two-gap defenses in our scheme as opposed to one gap, and I've just chosen these two to give you examples of that. But a Falcon defense for us is what we call a two-gap defense. It means that our linebackers are responsible for more than just one gap. And you can see this would be perhaps a split call. It could have been a weak call. It might have been a short call. But it replaced the reduction to the split side of the pro formation. And the linebacker, we tell him he's in a nest technique, but he is responsible with flow to him of responding to the alley, and with flow away of moving to the near side one gap. He has a two-gap responsibility. The inside linebacker, by contrast, is what we call a 31 linebacker, and that means the first number tells him the gap responsibility that he has. And you can see, rather than lettering our gaps, we number our gaps to correspond with techniques. A 3 technique aligns in a 3 gap. A 5 technique aligns in a 5 gap. Well, a 31 linebacker is responsible for the 3 gap with flow to him, and with flow away, he's responsible for the backside 1 gap. Right? But that would be a 2-gap defense in our scheme. We are also known and use quite a bit what we would call a 1-gap defense. And when you hear us talk about Hawk, Hawk for us is a 1-gap defense. And that means now that for the Eagle backer, someone else has taken his alley responsibility. He's no longer a nest player where he would have gone to the alley. He is now a Hawk player. He's an inside 1-gap player, and the alley is taken by someone else. It's taken by someone in the secondary. So we get an 8th person if we're up against a 7-man front. All right? And then the inside linebacker also is changed. He is now a 32 technique. 32 meaning he has the 3-gap responsibility with flow to him, but the 2 on the backside says that both 1 gaps are taken. There is no gap responsibility for him on the backside. He loves to play this technique because he is what we call an overlap player, and he simply shuffles and presses the first open seam on the backside. And so those are 2 types of reductions that we use. There are others, but those are 2 types of reductions that we use to get changes with the same looks. All right, next I'd just like to quickly go through some of our coverage concepts with you. We use 6 base zone coverages. And I don't believe, particularly in a high school situation or a college situation that lacks a spring practice, that all 6 of these coverages are needed. But we could probably be very successful and play only 6 zone coverages through the course of a year. They break down into two kinds. We have weak rotations, which are shown here. The base is shown here on the screen, and the weak rotations are odd-numbered coverages that correspond and go with weak rotations with a weak placement call, a short placement call, could be part of a split placement call. And those 3 calls, we try to make all 3 look pretty much alike. And one of the coverages many would call quarter halves. And it would be a rotation by the strong safety to the weak side, a corner behind him playing true halves, the free safety and corner to the strong side playing quarters. It's an interesting coverage. It's a coverage that very much fits our run support personnel, because you remember that this triangle out here is our drop linebacker. When he lines up against the great tight ends that we see in our conference, he is giving away a lot of size. Whereas most people would put a strong safety outside of him and force him to muscle with the tight end and force the ball to bubble to the strong safety. We ask our drop linebacker to operate out of his strength. And When we would get a reach block, we would ask our drop, rather than to muscle, we would ask him to get width, get upfield, use his quickness and agility to get himself to a place that is basically 2x2, and feel like he had the advantage because of his quickness and speed, and his run support would come from inside from our free safety. Now, that helps the drop in his role playing because he is a finesse player. It also requires that your free safety is a heavy run support guy, such as ours. So that coverage, the quarter-quarter halves coverage, gives us a weak rotation. It also gives us run support to the strong side that fits our personnel. We can also, from that look, play a 3-deep zone. And we can line up in the quarter-quarter halves look. And one of the things that we will very often get will be teams that will see us in that look, and they'll want to run what we call the converter, or the fade. And we can line up in that look and now run to thirds. So we give the same look. We can play thirds from it, or we can play the quarter-quarter halves coverage. And then the third look is probably one that is very common to you, and most people call it cover 2, but we would run it out of the same pre-snap read. And we would have our corner line up as though we were in halves, our free safety line up as though we were in quarters, our corner line up as though we were in corners. And now we would just flat foot our corner and play him as a run support guy. This is one of the few times you will see our corner in run support. It is one of the few times that you will see our drop in a position with run support outside of him. And you know by what we've gone through in our philosophy that that is not a coverage that fits as well with our personnel, because our corners don't run support real well and our drops aren't muscle guys. But it is a good changeup for us. We use it some in the passing game. We also use it some with formation in the boundary to help us. But all 3 looks can come out of the same basic pre-snap read. I'll proceed now just quickly to our strong rotations. And with our strong rotations, we first begin with, very simply, a 3-deep zone. And as we line up in that fashion, our strong safety, again, now this is the 4th coverage that we've talked over. He is, again, a flat and contained guy. We're playing thirds behind him. It's a secure coverage deep. It is probably one of our poorer run support coverages. It forces us to play more of a 7-on-7, 6-on-6 kind of ratio, but we certainly use it a great deal. From there, we have 2 types of overshifted coverages, and they may look exactly like 0 to you to start with, exactly like our 3-deep zone. And one is simply a quarter halves coverage, just like we did with one of the odd coverages. The only difference is now the strong safety is to the strong side, and so now we have an overshifted coverage to the 2 receiver side. We have a halves coverage with our drop on the weak side. So that would be an overshifted coverage that would allow us to take away flood routes to the strong side and also give us more run support to the strong side. And then the third, which we can either align in or we can run to, is a coverage that uses our personnel perhaps differently than many others. Most people call it free safety over the top, but we don't do it with that personnel. Our strong safety or eagle safety is wide. Our free safety is now inside. Our corner now plays halves, our corner plays halves, and our drop is out over the X. And again, this does a better job with our role playing because it allows our corners to play deep zones. They're cover guys. It allows our safeties to be the run support guys. And our free safety now on a typical sweep would be an alley player, whereas our strong safety continues to be a contained player. And so it allows us to continue to role play and operate from our strengths while doing a good job against flood coverages and run support to the strong side. Now hopefully this tape has given you just kind of a solid introduction to our scheme. Again, I reiterate, we're not trying to sell our scheme. We're not saying this is the greatest scheme in the history of football, but it is a scheme that we know and has been effective for us. Feel free to use our staff as a resource. Denny Marson has a wealth of background. Denny is 45. He's been an assistant head coach at North Carolina, was with Dick Crum for 14 years there and at Miami, Ohio, and does a superb job working with our interior three. Greg Colby, many of you will know because of his exploits here at Illinois, was a great coach at Slarman High School, won some state titles, and also went to coach at Naperville before joining Michigan State staff and then coming with us. And Greg coaches our rush linebackers and is also responsible for our special teams. Bob Gambold would be very interested in talking with you. He has one of the tough positions to coach for us, our drop linebackers, real role players there. Steve Bernstein, of course, has been in the scheme as long as I have, and I feel very fortunate to have had the long-term association with Steve that I've had. He's one of the fine secondary coaches in the country. He coaches the defensive backs, and we'd be glad to share with you. And then I coach the inside linebackers. Just so you're aware, and perhaps would be afraid to ask, we do share our cut-up films, but we do ask that they remain here in the office. We do share our game films, and there's perhaps a possibility that they could be taped, and you could use those outside of our office. We do not share our notebooks. Our practice sessions are open to you, and we're more than willing to spend time with you here on campus. And most of all, we just thank you for your interest in Illinois football and for thinking enough of us to come down and share with us. Thank you.